Hello, welcome everyone to the 2023 NNLM Virtual Symposium on Health Misinformation. We are glad you are able to join us today. I am Jamia Williams. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Consumer Health Program Specialist. Went too far. All right, we just have a few technical items to cover. All attendees have been muted, but we do welcome your questions and comments in the Zoom chat at any time. V Fairs is proudly providing technical assistance today. NNLM staff will keep an eye on the chat with me. Please be sure to select everyone from the drop-down menu when posting your comments in chat to ensure everyone sees them. Submit questions for the speaker using the Q&A function to ensure they do not get lost in chat. We have a live captioner for this event. You can access the closed captions by clicking on the icon with the three dots and then selecting closed caption. If you would like to share on social media, we encourage you to use the hashtag for the event, HelpMisInfoNNLM. Before we get started, I would like to share a little about who we are. The National Institutes of Health is the nation's leading medical research agency. Many of you might be more familiar with the National Center for Allergies and Infectious Diseases, which is one of the many institutes and centers at NIH. NLM, or the National Library of Medicine, is one of the 27 institutes and offices of the National Institutes of Health. It's the world's largest biomedical library and produces online resources like PubMed and Medline Plus. NNLM, the network of the National Library of Medicine, is an outreach program of NLM, working to ensure health professionals and the public have equal access to health information. NNLM is made up of 7 regional medical libraries, 3 national offices, and 4 national centers, all providing training, funding, and engagement opportunities to over 9,000 NNLM member organizations. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Winn W. Wasson. Thank you.
All right, let's see here. Oh, yes. So, yes, pardon the cat. All right, so good afternoon. I'm Winn Wasson, and I am the social science librarian at Syracuse University Libraries. And today I'm going to talk about a workshop that I created about the misrepresentation and misappropriation of research. All right, so a few things to note before I begin. Obviously, this is a symposium focused on health misinformation. The workshop I'm presenting on is geared for a broad audience of researchers and future researchers because the misappropriation and misrepresentation of research is a problem that faces multiple fields. Consequently, the workshop that I do is multidisciplinary in scope, and it includes examples from other sciences as well as the social sciences and the humanities. So this presentation is going to include examples from outside health sciences as well. So obviously we've, over the past few days, if folks have attended, there's been a lot of definitions of misinformation and disinformation coming on multiple times. And of course, Dr. Nicole Cook also spoke about malinformation at this symposium. That said, yesterday at his keynote, Jevin West spoke about the importance of having a shared definition of the terms. So I'll go ahead and just briefly define them. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'll define misinformation as false information that an individual or group may consume or share that the individual or group doesn't know is false. Disinformation will be false information that is created purposefully for the purpose of misleading others by, and it's created by an individual or a group who knows that the information is false. And then I'll use Dr. Cook's definition of malinformation as false information that is shared with a distinct intent to cause harm, and in the case of racism, to maintain the status quo. So the issue with false information is, of course, the effect that it has on society. Much of the US media's focus on false information has been on how it increases distrust or hostility toward authority and fellow citizens, possibly leading to social breakdown. We saw this with false information about COVID-19 and many other events that occurred in the year 2020. But another effect, I think, that's just as important is the goal or effect of misinformation, not discussed as much, as to suppress active citizenship by encouraging defensive inaction. That latter point brings me to where my interest in misinformation and disinformation actually started. So I started to get interested in mis and disinformation after a contested presidential election in which protesters were using social media to say that the election had been stolen and in order to organize protests. And I'm sure you all know that I'm talking about the 2009 Iranian presidential election. At that time, US media was covering about how individuals were organizing protests in Iran using Twitter. And I decided to take a look at the messages that were going out on Twitter and found an interesting phenomenon. So you would see person A would give a date and time and location for a protest, and person B would respond by saying, no, person A was with the regime and the protest was a trap. Then person A would respond and say, no, person B was with the regime, it wasn't a trap, come on out. And many of the tweets, especially those naming the date and place of the protests, have since been taken down, and what remains is generally the ones that warn of traps. But these two right here generally illustrate what occurred. One from June 5th, 2009 says, I think the rally at Imam Khomeini's grave is also a trap. It's very far from the city and they can slaughter protesters, hashtag Iran election. The other earlier from June 20th says, do not let fear keep you from rally. Fear of man is its own trap. Hashtag Tehran, hashtag Iran election, hashtag Iran elections. So in truth, tweets encouraging people to go to a rally or telling them that they were traps could have both come from individuals within the regime. But the effect of the confusion would be for Iranians to stay home because that was the safe choice, and that would basically help things settle down. As I said on the previous slide, one goal or effect of mis and disinformation is increased distrust and hostility toward authority and fellow citizens, possibly leading to social breakdown. But another, as I said, is to suppress active citizenship by encouraging defensive action, or defensive inaction, excuse me. As those of us here know, misinformation and disinformation creep into the public's understanding of research, which can take a few forms. So first, there's the misunderstanding of research, which is somewhat akin to misinformation. Essentially, an individual comes to faulty conclusions about research, either on their own, or they'll adopt the faulty conclusion of an indirect source of information about the research. And of course, that person can share those faulty conclusions with others. Then there's the misrepresentation of research. I define this as misrepresenting the conclusions of research or putting forward misleading selective representations of the conclusions. So this is a lot of times done to support an ideological agenda or political actions. I think it could be considered misinformation or disinformation, depending on whether the individual behind it knows whether what they're saying is not an accurate depiction of the researcher's conclusions. And just to give you some examples here, notably many of these comes from journalistic sites, which has been noted at the symposium are frequently where the rumors get started in mistranslating what research has to say. So one here is a story from NPR about unauthorized immigration and the number of arrests by the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol. Basically, one person could be arrested multiple times in the course of, say, a single month, but each person's arrest does not necessarily constitute a unique individual. This might have the effect of making the problem seem larger than perhaps others might think it might think it really is. And of course, not everyone knows this, but there are some people who are aware of the distinction between apprehensions and unique individuals, but leave it out to create an implicit narrative that these are unique individuals. So, sort of the bread and butter of misrepresenting research is selectively interpreted statistics, a frequent tool of misrepresenting research. And of course, there's no dearth of examples from the pandemic. At one point, some people were announcing that convalescent plasma created a 35% reduction in COVID-19 mortality. They cited a Mayo Clinic study. However, in addition to the study not yet having undergone peer review, it looked at individuals who received high concentrations of convalescent plasma versus low concentrations of the convalescent plasma. There was no placebo control done, and that 35% was distinguishing mortality between the high concentrations and the low concentrations, rather than, and it had no control group receiving a placebo whatsoever. And then there's misappropriating research. This usually entails a reasonably accurate representation of the research, but they use it to support an ideological agenda or political actions that the researcher does not advocate for. So the misappropriation of research, I think, can be considered misinformation or disinformation, again, depending on whether the individual behind it knows whether what they're saying is an accurate depiction of the research's conclusions. Here are just some examples of, again, how this might happen. A lot of this draws again from journalistic coverage, but there's this example here, an article from the Washington Post about the Census Bureau reported in 2020, reported from the 2020 census that the white population in the United States, the white non-Hispanic population, I should say, in the US had decreased between 2010 and 2020. Now, this could provide white supremacist groups with information that they would use for their agendas. Even though, having personally met people who work at the Census Bureau, I know that is not an agenda they would want their research to be used to support. Also, the New York Times published this study about a hypothesis that the virus that causes COVID-19 is more likely to mutate and thus create new variants in patients with weakened immune systems. I should note that some of the studies that the New York Times article cites are case studies that only have one individual patient as a subject. But in any case, a researcher might need to be on guard for people who start demonizing individuals with compromised immune systems as being the ones to blame for COVID-19 variants, though it's certainly not something an ethical medical professional would want. And then there's also this survey by the Gallup organization. They and others have conducted surveys about sexual orientation and gender identification that breaks down demographics by age group and or generation. And this particular survey by Gallup was conducted in 2022, and it found that 19.7% of Gen Z adults, which it defines as individuals born starting in 1997, 19.7% identify as members of the LGBTQ plus community. And one needs to be prepared for research like this to be used as justification for efforts that we currently see to curtail access to information about sexual orientation and gender identity. Of course, I'm assuming that this is not something that the researcher here would want to advocate for. And unfortunately, misunderstanding, misrepresentation, and misappropriation of research can often have very troubling consequences for researchers, such as harassment, bullying, and violence or threats of violence. And I think that Dr. Cook's term malinformation is highly appropriate here. One example is a historian of ancient India named Ramala Thapar, who has been in contention for years with the Hindu nationalist movement in that country, which is currently in power in India. So the Hindu nationalist movement advocates for a definition of Indian citizenship that excludes Muslims and Christians, and its ideology also advances ideas that claim to show Hinduism as the root of worldwide civilization. And to that end, they've created textbooks that are historically inaccurate for the purpose of fostering that agenda. And Ramala Thapar has pushed back against this. And as a result, she's been on the receiving end of death threats for years. And more recently in the US, medieval historian Dorothy Kim has pushed back on narratives about the Crusades, and has narratives about the Crusades that are advocated by the alt-right to advance their white nationalist agenda. And as a result of her taking that on, she was doxxed by Milo Yiannopoulos and has been harassed by other members of the alt-right online community. And of course, we have seen multiple examples of this happening with public health officials. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, public health officials at all levels of government, it should be noted. Now, we do need to note that this is not all happening in a vacuum. At the LOEX 2022 conference, Elizabeth Ellis, Megan Webb, and Amanda Kaufman gave an excellent presentation about how and disinformation are spreading, not just because of technology and psychology, but because of a wider decline in trust in authorities and institutions. So there are social, cultural, historic, economic, and political contexts to this decline in trust, and technology is just aiding it. That said, Ellis, Webb, and Kaufman do point out that these institutions have by no means been neutral with regard to race, ethnicity, sex, gender, socioeconomic status, geographic location, and many other factors in identity or one's circumstances. And so with that in mind, they point out that much of the commentary on the decline in trust in authorities and institutions has been written by people who have been beneficiary of these institutions as they have existed. So the last time something like this happened at such a scale was probably when the printing press became widely used. And so in a way, it's somewhat analogous to the idea of the printing press as an analogy to the internet. So the printing press was a factor behind the success of the Enlightenment and the Reformation, which of course replaced the authorities and institutions of medieval and pre-modern Western Europe, especially the primacy of the Roman Catholic Church, with the authorities and institutions of the Enlightenment. Though, like with today's trends, there were other factors that were contributing to those movements. And as I mentioned, with the previous slide, the Enlightenment was not neutral, but it largely contributed to the authorities and institutions we have today, which of course are the ones that are now being challenged. So these are the issues that researchers have to contend with these days, and I thought it would be good to prepare researchers and future researchers for these scenarios and the environment that fosters them. So I created and have taught a workshop on the misrepresentation and misappropriation of research for the Syracuse University Libraries Learn at Syracuse University Libraries Workshop Series. The current title is The Misappropriation and Misrepresentation of Research, Strategies for Facing a Growing and Problematic Trend. And I've taught it 6 times so far and have another iteration slated for May. So a little bit about the format. They're about 50 to 60 minutes in length. And I also have an extra 15 minutes at the end for discussion. The workshops are geared toward both faculty and graduate students. That said, the participants have been graduate and undergraduate students, as well as visiting scholars. So with regard to the content, I start with a content advisory that some of what we'll cover might be upsetting, and that participants should feel free to leave if they need to. I also have a disclaimer about what the workshop is designed to do and what it is not designed to do. It's a complicated topic. I encourage them to get the expertise of others who have different training and lived experiences than I do. And then I open with some questions about common misconceptions about their field of research and some specific examples of research in their field getting misunderstood. And then I present the why of the workshop, which is essentially what I shared with all of you in some of the previous slides. The next activity there is that I share a video of Dr. Anthony Fauci and Senator Rand Paul during a March 2021 Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee hearing about the government's COVID-19 response, followed by some discussion questions. The video looks extremely prescient now, and I'm going to see if I am able to share it.
Infection. What study shows significant reinfection, hospitalization, and death after either natural infection or the vaccine? It doesn't exist. There is no evidence that there are significant reinfections after vaccine. In fact, I don't think we have a hospitalization in the United States after the 2-week period after the second vaccination. We don't have a death in the United States.
You're not hearing what I'm saying about variants. We're talking about wild type versus variants.
And what proof is there that there are significant reinfections with hospitalizations and death from the variants? None in our country, 0.
Well, because we don't have a prevalent of a variant yet. We're having one, can I finish? We're having 117 that's becoming more dominant.
Your policy based on conjecture.
No,
it
isn't based on conjecture.
Variants, so you want people to wear a mask for another couple years.
No.
You've been vaccinated and you parade around in 2 masks for show.
No.
You can't get it again. There's virtually 0% chance you're going to get it, and yet you're telling people that have had the vaccine, who have immunity. You're defying everything we know about immunity by telling people to wear a mask who've been vaccinated. No. Instead, you should be saying there is no science to say we're going to have a problem from the large number of people being vaccinated. You want to get rid of vaccine hesitancy? Tell them they can quit wearing their mask after they get the vaccine. You want people to get the vaccine? Give them a reward instead of telling them that the nanny state's going to be there for 3 more years and you got to wear a mask forever. People don't want to hear it. There's no science behind it.
Well, let me just state for the record that masks are not theater. Masks are protective. And we
have immunity there, theater. If you already have immunity, you're wearing a mask to give comfort to others. You're not wearing a mask because of any science.
I totally disagree with you.
Dr. Fauci, if you could respond so that we could understand the difference between the virus itself and the variants and the reason for a mask.
I'm sorry, ma'am, I can't hear.
If you could respond to the question so that we could all understand the difference between the vaccine in controlling the wild type versus the variants that are out there and the reason for wearing a mask, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, yes. First of all, when you have a variant, you have an immunity that you get with convalescent sera and the same sort of thing. If I vaccinate you or me against the wild type, you get a certain level of antibody that's specific for a particular viral strain. If there's a circulating variant, you don't necessarily have it. You have some spillover immunity to be sure, but you diminish by anywhere from 2 to 8-fold the protection. So the point I'm saying is that there are variants in now circulating. The point that Senator Paul was making was that if you look at wild type only, there is some clear-cut credence to what he's saying. But we are living right now in a situation where we're having a dominance of 117, which was the original UK. We have a very troublesome variant in New York City, a 526. We've got 2 variants in California, a 427, 429, and we have a number of others. So we're not dealing with a static situation of the same virus. That was the only point I'm making.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Dr. Fauci, thank you for.
All right. So obviously, it is, kind of prescient there that there's discussion about, if you have the vaccine, everything's fine. And this is right before the Delta variant gets started and it's reinfecting people, and then comes Omicron. First time I used that clip was in April of 2021, and when I came back to use it again in the fall of 2021, it was quite stunning to watch again. So thus I've continued using it because I think it, especially in retrospect, does point out, is all the more impactive. After I show that video, I have workshop participants look at what were some techniques that Dr. Fauci has used to counter the narrative that Senator Paul is trying to push. And then I asked participants what Dr. Fauci could have done better. Many of the responses about what he did well hit on the techniques that I cover later in the workshop and that I will discuss later in this presentation. The main constructive criticism that participants make of his techniques, though, is that it's very heavy in jargon. Though it should be noted that he was using the language of the time, which is March 2021, to describe the pandemic when Greek letters had not yet been adopted to denote the variants. And so there's the prevalence of the numbers. There's also the use of the term UK variant, that the numbers have been, Greek letters have been put in place to supersede. Then I get started on strategies for countering the misappropriation and misrepresentation of research. So first and foremost, I say to participants, if they're doing teaching, whether it's as lead instructor or as a teaching assistant, I encourage them to use the undergraduate classroom as a trial run. And it runs on the assumption that the general public is going to have at most the understanding of their research that undergraduates do. So I tell workshop participants, ask students in their class about what they might have heard about their topic. This particular technique derives from my own experience teaching political science at community colleges for 6 years. I was thrown a lot of ideologically slanted information, some true, some false. There was always an instigator, and I needed to respond to it. And so there were some approaches that I developed that I share with the workshop participants, and then I'll share here momentarily. One thing to note about this approach too is that it can also serve as pre-bunking those students to be more resilient in the face of mis and disinformation as well. So another thing that's kind of experimental here that I'm trying out with the workshop, it remains a work in progress, and of course factors keep changing. So during the last iteration on this past March 22nd, I decided to experiment with ChatGPT to see how well it might do as a stand-in for an undergraduate classroom, particularly if someone is not teaching. So I had the workshop participants tell me about the subject of their research, and then I asked ChatGPT to tell me about the subject. Then I asked ChatGPT to rephrase the explanation as for a high school level audience. So of course, ChatGPT is drawing from freely available content on the internet that much of the public is drawing on. So, another part of the idea here, which again, I'm still testing, is that ChatGPT might not just be a good stand-in for an undergraduate classroom. It might also be a good way to gauge what potential misinformation is out there about one's research, though it should be noted that the data it's drawing from does not include what's been posted in the most recent years. So it does not exactly work for tracking what misinformation is coming out at the moment. And of course, AI itself is constantly changing. So this is definitely an experimental strategy. Then in the workshop, I go into some more preparation strategies. The first of which is to keep current in the scholarly communication of one's own field. And the nice thing about this is that it also gives me a chance to plug the library. So I showcase some databases that have bibliometric or alert features that will allow workshop participants to see what research and what researchers out there are having an impact in their field in the realm of scholarly communication. I also talk about the importance of keeping track of how one's own research is cited. So participants can similarly use those own tools, institutional repositories, research profile platforms. Those can all track how their research is being cited. So one of the things that I utilize when I am talking about the zone factor is I utilize our institutional repository at Syracuse University, which is called Surface. And I log into my own account and show them the map of it's a bpress platform, and I show them a map of where various people have downloaded some of what I've put up on Surface, and it's kind of interesting to show different locations, some of which identify an institution, some of which don't. So one of the more interesting ones has been basically a location in Northern Virginia that is just a big collection of server farms. So that's been an interesting one to think about. No institution is given, just the location, Ashburn, Virginia, I believe. So like I say, they can use these tools as well as and personal research platforms to track their own research. And this is obviously beneficial for them to do for multiple reasons, namely research reputation within the field, and not just because of the potential for the misappropriation and misrepresentation of their research. Then I talk about tools from outside scholarly communication that can help researchers keep tabs on the public, the media, and popular discourses about their field of research and of their own research. So this includes following individuals and threads on social media that are related to one's research or field of research. Then there's also Plum X metrics, Altmetrics can keep track of these, but usually only specific publications. So thus it's important to monitor social media discussions more broadly and not just discussions about specific publications. And of course, we're going to have to see how useful this continues to be, especially with Twitter. Again, this is very rapidly revolving, and so each iteration of this workshop that I do changes in some way from the previous one. I also recommend to participants that they get news alerts from platforms like Google News that can look more at traditional media. And depending on the platform, some research profile platforms can also be a useful way to keep track of the coverage of one's research in the news and on social media. So when I'm offering the workshop, I also offer some strategies for handling situations when they come up, not just preparation. And again, advising them to practice these in a classroom setting, which of course is, like I said, is where I develop them. One suggestion is to find a grain of truth in the falsehood and then correct that misunderstanding. So an example that I give here is from a Washington Post op-ed from a nursing home administrator whose employees were hesitant to get vaccinated for the COVID-19 vaccine. Some of them worried that it might alter their DNA or put a microchip in them. I'm sure folks here have heard, of that misinformation circulating around. And the administrator basically sort of tried to assuage concerns by finding the grain of truth in what was there. So he said, he explained the mechanism of an mRNA vaccine, how that works, and how that differentiates from the alteration of DNA. And then he talked about the tracking microchip on the packaging for the vaccine, but that there wasn't an actual chip being injected into someone itself, that was in the vaccine itself, that being injected into somebody. There's another example here that I give of statistics on contraception effectiveness. So as an adolescent, I was told that condoms failed to prevent pregnancy 1 out of 6 times. This graphic is from the Guttmacher Institute, a think tank and research organization specializing in health research, reproductive health research, that I'm sure some of you are already familiar with. And the interesting thing here is that the 1 out of 6 failure rate right here is from typical use. With perfect use, the failure rate is only 2%, not 16%. And this particular example of finding a grain of truth segues into another strategy of handling a situation. An audience might be skeptical when you're showing them information that contradicts their worldviews. So I recommend to workshop participants that if they can, they should take an organization or individual that provides accurate information about the issue in question and show that organization or individual also providing information that has been used to support other causes that the audience might support. And this was the case with these Guttmacher Institute statistics. In 2014, while I was still teaching, a student in one of my classes was providing inaccurate statistics about contraception to the entire class. So I showed a contemporaneous version of this graphic that's on this slide. And then I showed statistics that the Guttmacher Institute put forward in 2014 about the number of abortions in the United States from Roe v. Wade to 2014. I did clarify to students that the Guttmacher Institute supports legalized abortion, but that anti-abortion groups have used their statistics in their arguments against abortion, which was the view held by this particular student. So the idea was, here's some accurate statistics about contraception. And by the way, this organization has also supplied information that is used by causes you support. Now, of course, the Guttmacher Institute could see this as misappropriation of their research, but I did want the students to trust that the information I was showing about contraceptive effectiveness, I wanted them to trust that because I worried that inaccurate statistics could affect that the inaccurate statistics that this one student was providing could affect other students' decisions and behaviors. When I was teaching political science, I very much made a point to stay out of giving my own opinion unless it was about health information and health misinformation, and then I did correct things because there it has a lot of stakes, as we all know, on people's lives. And the foundation of all this is recognizing what the debate over false information is really about at a social, political, cultural level, etc. So, for example, the debate about masks and vaccines is not really about masks or the vaccines. So I recommend to workshop participants that they familiarize themselves with the belief system in which the misunderstanding or misrepresentation of research arises. And then if they find themselves in a situation where they need to correct the record, they can employ empathy and a dialogue in which they respectfully contextualize a particular false belief in a larger belief system and lived experience. This might help with at least moving on from the false belief in question. And returning to that contraception example, I discussed the efforts by religious groups to promote abstinence-only approaches, but added that not everyone will follow that recommendation, however well-intentioned it may be, and that this can lead to adverse consequences. I also recommend putting the larger debate into a historical or comparative cultural context. So people might begin to think more broadly about their belief system if they learn about analogs from another time and or place. I used the historical analogy of the printing press and the internet earlier in this presentation. I think that more historical research into the effect of the printing press on the spread of misinformation could very well help us better understand our era, as long as we keep in mind that the difference between an analogy and a facsimile, of course. Another great example was at a presentation yesterday by Tenley Sablatsky, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, about a historical analogy between London's cholera epidemics and the COVID-19 pandemic. I highly encourage when videos are shared that people visit that presentation if they have not already. And it might be helpful to discuss in non-jargony terms how the procedures for approving the safety and efficacy of drugs in the United States compares with that in other countries as a way to potentially assuage concerns that people might have about drug safety and efficacy. And this again is sort of the cross-cultural, or in this case, cross-national comparisons that can help people understand that, to use the quotation, there's nothing new under the sun, or again, there's also the one, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. So at the conclusion of the workshop, I emphasize to participants that if they are being harassed or feel unsafe, that they should let their supervisor or someone else in authority know, whether it's at their current or future institution. And that is something, of course, that is situational, and that I advise in my disclaimer is best addressed by individuals who have that expertise. I also underscore that the success of any strategy is dependent on the interplay between the identity characteristics of the researcher and of the audience in the situation. So when I was using these strategies in the classroom, I was a white male speaking to classrooms that mostly consisted of white conservative students. Had I not been a white male, or had my classroom looked different, there might have been the need for different strategies or to adjust the ones that I was using. And you might have noticed that the two examples of bullying I gave, the two specific examples, were both of women being harassed by men. And I don't think that that is a coincidence. So I add that caveat to my students at the end of, to the participants at the end of every workshop, and I'll share some more thoughts on that at the close of this presentation. The feedback I've received about the workshop has generally been positive. Some examples of what students have identified as most valuable include the citation tracking, which of course is helpful for research in general, and the idea of familiarizing themselves with the cultural and social context of people's misperceptions and misconceptions. Some examples of what participants say that they've learned that they indicated will change how they do research include incorporating consideration of public communications into how they do research, and the strategy of using the undergraduate classroom for trial runs to practice how to explain their research in more accessible terms. In terms of takeaways, I found that many participants have already had an experience with people misunderstanding their field of research or their own research, frequently from family members. I've also found that students want to have in-depth conversations about the topic, in addition to having that workshop about strategies for preparing and handling situations. So originally the workshop was basically 50 to 60 minutes in length, and that was it. But there was one time when it went, I think, 15 to 20 minutes over. And so since then, I've added that extra 15 minutes for discussion at the end. Workshop is still a work in progress, and I'm working to improve assessment of its effectiveness. Unfortunately, attendance has often been suboptimal. I stopped holding workshops on Zoom because the 2 workshops that I scheduled in the fall of 2022 were on Zoom. People signed up and no one attended. Again, I think folks were anticipating there'd be a recording, but if there's nothing to record, there will be no recording. So, from here on out, I'm holding the workshops in person again. There's also that difficulty of following up with participants to see if they've utilized the strategies of the workshop, and if so, what results they've had. And I'm cognizant that there are limitations to what I can teach students based on my own perspective and lived experience, and that I'm going to be unaware of many of those limitations until someone points them out to me. So coming back to the caveat, I left the workshop's participants with addressing this issue is going to require dialogue and collaboration that includes a diverse array of perspectives and lived experiences. Consequently, I'm looking for potential collaborators, including perhaps some of you who are also interested in defending research from misappropriation and mischaracterization, and defending researchers from bullying and harassment. So here is the bibliography. I will wait a little bit on that in case anyone wants to capture it real quick. And with that, thank you, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Winn. It looks like someone was interested to hear any strategies you use to access your workshop.
Yes, that is, like I say, right now it's sort of in its infancy now, and so the assessment that I've gotten right now is mainly been what folks have gotten out of the workshop and sort of what they intend to do going forward. I would like to do more follow-up to see if participants are integrating those strategies into their research or their teaching. I would like to do that. I have not done that yet. So assessment is something that I would like to be more intentional about. And like I say, looking for ways that that might occur with following up with participants and seeing effectiveness. And then there's also the notion that again, it's been a limited audience, unfortunately. And so I'm curious, like I say, interested to see if there might be potential collaborators out there who can, see, how well this works in other venues as well. All right, so I'm seeing a question here. Can you give an example of how you present content differently when you have different audiences, especially how you mentioned an all-white conservative audience versus one that is not? I did. There is one of the things that I try to do there is to sort of look when I'm doing this workshop, see the audience ahead of time. So I try to, when I'm using examples here, use examples that are not necessarily culturally sensitive, because I do in the workshops get a lot of international students. So I have found, though, that the examples that I have used have not generally caused issues. But it is one of these things that interacting with the different audiences that come to the workshop. Again, there is the point that white male talking to a white conservative audience, and it was pointed out to me by some international visiting scholars the notion that language is also an issue in how someone is perceived, and because of that, that was something that they noted, that it is. Language is another issue that can affect receptiveness too, that I now definitely keep in mind. Let's see, next one, is there a component of self-care when discussing this with students? Seems like a topic that unfortunately can be so emotional, especially when students are defending their research against their families at times. That is another workshop that I'm working on with some colleagues of mine at SU, is basically information wellness. I think that definitely, when we're working on putting that together, I think that is a good idea to integrate into this particular workshop as well. And I think one thing I would say is that I have noticed that in the past, at a previous institution, I put together a January term course about basically media literacy, and it was based on the notion of information creation as a process in the ACRL framework, basically looking at the process through which news gets from an observation of the field to what one consumes, and then the psychological process that goes on when we evaluate it, to try to educate it that way, rather than necessarily labeling information as good or bad information. And I noticed it had a toll on the students. And so for the last session there, I brought in a counselor at that institution to talk with the students about basically techniques for stress relief and wellness in general. But I think that is very important, because I think that is generally something that when we're doing education, we are very good at getting students to deconstruct what they already know, but and certainly there's the notion that what they construct off of that should be something that is theirs. But I think in that period there needs to be certainly more emphasis on dealing with the fact that this can create issues that way with information wellness with mental wellness and so forth. Let's see. I am a public health instructor at a small HBCU in Oklahoma. I would be interested in offering this training to my students if you would be interested. Yes, please. My email is there, and so please feel free to email me.
Thank you for the great
So,
questions so far. If you have any
just
more.
a response to seeing in the chat here. I bet collaborating, co-presenting with a researcher whose work has been directly miscommunicated and misappropriated would be powerful. I do want to incorporate, there is actually a new faculty member, she's new this year in our anthropology department, who deals on issues of migration to Russia, particularly from outside of traditional, outside the former Soviet bloc. So basically from, say, Western countries, migration to Russia, often because of cultural or tax issues and so forth. And she certainly has been at the receiving end of that. So I am looking to, essentially, be collaborating with her in the future as well. We've discussed that.
So I'll wait about a minute or so to see if any other questions come up. Thank you so far for great questions. Oh, here one, there's a question.
Do you get researchers in your workshop who have dealt with the aggressive trolls who attack their research? I'm wondering how you would advise them. This also relates to information wellness, I think. As of yet, like I say, I have not had folks yet who have had to deal with that level. Most of the folks I have had in the workshop at this point have been graduate students. But like I say, that is one point why I'm planning on collaborating with the anthropology professor, because I think she has, due to the nature of her work, she has, I think, been on the receiving end of some of that. So are there any of the questions that you've noticed that I've missed, or?
Nope, I haven't seen anything else.
Okay.
A lot of thank yous.
Yes, yeah, thank you all for coming. And like I say, if you were interested, please feel free to email me there.
Yes, thank you so much for Winn, Wasson. Just a few items before we end the session. If you're interested in claiming MLA CE credit for this session and others, you'll receive an email after the symposium ends with a questionnaire and instructions to claim CE. We have 30 minutes until our next session. We encourage you to visit one of the booths for the event, then maybe get away from your computer, move, stretch, get a drink, and maybe go outside. We look forward to seeing you in our next session at 3 p.m. Eastern. Thank you for joining us for day 3, which is the last day of the Health Misinformation Symposium. Before we wrap up, we want to encourage you to join the network. Membership is organizational, not individual, and offers benefits such as funding opportunities and print resources. If you would like to continue exploring health misinformation, please join NNLM at up-and-coming sessions of our Health Misinformation webinar series. This series features presentations from expert guest speakers and will enable librarians, public health professionals, health educators, and healthcare providers to explore various aspects of health misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, and learn practical and evidence-based solutions for how to identify it and help curb its spread. These presentations will be scheduled intermittently throughout the year, and you can learn more about up-and-coming sessions by checking out the NNLM training calendar. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending.